AI Dash is the exclusive sponsor of Satellite Superheroes, unleashing the power of satellites and AI, simplifying your vegetation management. Go out to ai-dash.com, find out more. On this episode of Satellite Superheroes, we are talking to Jeff Postelwait. He is the senior editor at T&D World, and we're talking about utilities. We're talking about utility maintenance. We're talking about grid. We're talking everything that we possibly can about utilities because you need to know. Let's get cracking with the interview. Jeff, welcome to Satellite Superheroes. How are you doing today?
Hey, doing real well. It's a beautiful, cool day up here in Eugene, Oregon. I was wearing a flannel shirt on the 4th of July, which was a little odd, but I'm not complaining about it.
Come on, see what you just started rubbing our nose in it. Here in Louisiana, it's hot as hell. And it's just not fun at all.
My family, we were just down in California on vacation, and we were roasting. We're just not.
What was the temperature? I never even asked you.
I don't know. The gas prices were high, the temperatures were high, everything. I just stopped looking at the big numbers and just try to enjoy myself.
Because you were going down to the happiest place on earth, and you can't look at your wallet. You can't, because then it'll start extracting the joy from you.
It's one of those things where the digits are just spinning too fast for the human eye to comprehend.
You need an AI product for that.
I'm sending away for the data analytics on my bar tab at the Enchanted Tiki Lounge.
Which is a pretty cool place, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I do like that place. Yeah. All right, for the listeners out there, give us a little background on who Jeff is and why you're such an incredible professional.
Oh gosh, well, certainly, I've been writing about utilities and the electricity markets from the power plant side of things all the way to the light switch since I guess the Obama administration era, where a lot of things were changing with grant programs and renewable energy integration and so on. And now I'm over with T&D World, where I'm the senior editor. I spend most of my time researching in-depth, sort of deep dive stories on the different issues that we cover, from transmission and distribution engineering to grid edge stuff like virtual power plants, like I already said, renewable integration, electrification of the transportation sector, and just, the overall state of things in the utility business, because it is a business as well as a critical service for the way that we do things in our world, and things are changing.
Do you find that there's a velocity out there in the utility world? I mean, it's like for 100 years we did it this way, and then all of a sudden we're going to pack 100 years in 6 months.
Yeah, politicians like to describe government as like a big ship that turns slowly, and it's extremely frustrating to hear that when you live in a world that has so many urgent problems that need urgent action. But things are very similar in the utility space. Sometimes it seems like very little has changed since the current wars, when Edison was electrocuting elephants, to prove that his electricity was better. And we have an analog type of a system that, or at least we do in many cases, and we look over at phones, communication that was so quick to digitize comparatively, and now people have these powerful computers in their pockets, and they can do all sorts of things with them, and then they barely think about their electricity. There's always the hope that people are going to educate themselves and get more mindful of their energy usage and, be intelligent energy consumers. But the plain fact of it is, and I've been hearing this for, the better part of 2 decades now at conferences, which is people don't really think about their electricity until the bill comes due or the power goes out. And those are both bad times. And especially the bill part now, because everything is more expensive.
Yeah.
So I think probably one of the first things we wanted to talk about was just sort of the pressure that utilities are under always, but especially now to keep things cheap. There's all kinds of utilities under all kinds of models. We've got investor owned, we've got municipals here in Eugene, we've got a municipal. And then up in Portland, we've got Portland General Electric, big investor owned. We have some deregulated markets. They experimented with that here in Oregon actually back in the day, but we've got that mostly in places like Texas, some places on the East Coast, some on the West Coast. But regardless,
here's the funny thing. You bring up
Yeah.
something very interesting, because everybody has this, that utilities in general, if you look at it from a macro perspective, are pretty pragmatic. I got to deliver power. Hopefully it's reliable and cost effective. So, because the reality is I'm not running out to my post office box saying, whoa, I'm going to get a bill from the electric company. I'm going to be excited about it. That never happens. But these are all these different models out there. And you are in the business of trying to figure out how all of this stuff has to work together to achieve whatever that future looks like, right?
Yeah, and it's like I say, the hope that utilities always have and always talk about when you talk to them is that they hope that their ratepayers, their consumers, will become more just aware, I guess, of their consumption. And as we were joking about, I think before we started recording, gas is so high right now that I don't even look at the bill, just because what's the point? Like, there's not a lot I can do about it. It's kind of a sunk cost. I'm going to eat up a certain amount of energy in my average week regardless. So why do I torture myself? Like, I mean, and with gas, there's actually even more you can do. I mean, it's very little in practical terms, but with utility, with an electric utility on the consumer side, from the consumer point of view, there's even less, because in most cases it's a monopoly. And so the pressure that utilities are under to keep kilowatts cheap is something that I think maybe the average public doesn't necessarily understand, because we just think of them as just a business like any other. They want to sell as much as they possibly can. I hear that from lay people a lot, is they're just trying to sell electricity, and I have to tell them not. There are limits, and I think that people don't understand the limits of the power grid. We write a lot about that at T&D World. Sometimes when I hand a report, sometimes when I hand an article over to one of our tech editors, they're engineers, and so they're like, well, this is nice, but it doesn't take into account all of the technical problems that might arise in this sort of application. And they want people to be mindful of that, and people simply aren't. I think just because they don't know.
I think if I mean, come on, outside of you and me and maybe 3.5 other individuals geek out on utility conversations, the majority of people, it's easier for when you look at a cell phone and you're going, from this phone I can do anything. I can achieve my interests right there. And that's a tough one. That's a tough one.
It's to the point where it's actually a little weird to us when there's a mainstream conversation about electricity, like when the Texas freeze happened more than a year ago now, and people were talking about ERCOT. I was like, what? I talk about ERCOT a lot. It's part of my job to cover what they do, but I didn't really expect people to be talking about the history of Texas deregulation on mainstream news outlets. It's not something that I expect. John Oliver with Last Week Tonight, he's done a couple of really good reports recently on. He did one on deregulation in Texas and deregulation of energy in general, and he also did one on just the power grid and the state of our infrastructure. Which he's right to point out is not great. And then there's other parts of the only part really that I would push back on is kind of the assumption that utilities as a monolithic group, which first of all doesn't exist, but utilities as a group are sort of against renewable energy. He talked about solar, rooftop solar in specific. And, what I try to explain to lay people is, it's not that they're against it. It's just that there are real physical, like according to the laws of physics, electricity has to flow across the grid a certain way. Our grid was built for it to flow a certain way. And if you talk about taking rooftop solar and generating megawatts worth of electricity that flows in a backwards direction than the grid was designed, that's not, it's not as simple as just hooking, tab A into slot B. It's not interchangeable. Our grid, as people in the industry know, was designed to have a big power plant. Think like in SimCity, you plunk a power plant down in a remote area where it won't bother anybody. You run some transmission to the load center. Everything's very centralized. And now we're decentralizing, and we're talking about generating electricity from big C&I customers that have, fuel cells, that have small wind. We're talking about residential areas with rooftop solar, Walmarts with rooftop solar, all that stuff, and running it in a backwards direction. We're talking, and then you have to have, because we have an energy market, the resource has to be dispatchable, it has to be predictable, it has to make financial sense, which you can argue as to whether it should be a for-profit industry or not. That is a discussion that probably needs to happen. But you also have to deal with what we actually have already, which is a grid that was built to do something and an industry that was designed to do something a certain way. And now that's changing. So there will be bumps in that road.
Yeah. But you're right. I think but it's even hard to be able to communicate the realities that exist within the grid. I mean, these thermal units that exist out there, there's a force. They hit, and that creates the stability with it that we so just accept for granted. We just don't know anything about it. And so where do we go? One of the biggest challenges that I see too, along with all of the cost elements and along with the infrastructure and the grid and people popping on the grid and doing this and that, and the utilities' obligation to serve. And how do we start addressing? Let's say maintenance. The assets out there are old. If they are, you're not reconductoring right of ways. So how do we keep what we have maintained?
That is a huge and important question. There's probably not a more crucial question right now. I just wrapped up a story that's going to be coming out in our August edition, I believe. Or, sorry, I always have to think 2 months ahead, so I'm sometimes not sure of what month, but it's going to be coming out soon anyway. And it was all about supply chain issues. And, we have a grid that 90% of our power goes through transformers. And those transformers are made out of very inconvenient materials. They're big, they're heavy, they're made out of things that are subject to price swings and volatility. And a lot of it we don't make even in this hemisphere. It has to, especially milled steels have to come over from Korea or China or Germany. And so we have all these bottlenecks. We have this aging grid, and we have this global economy where we have to say to India, for example, we want to buy all this steel to build all these transformers because our transformers have a median age of something like 45, which is outside their operational limits, and they're starting to become unreliable. And then India says, that's nice for you. We're building a grid where we haven't had one before. So, why don't we just use what we have here, which is what we did, which is what the United States did. But now that manufacturing has offshored or gone away, we have something like 1 or 2 factories left in Ohio or Pennsylvania that make this special steel that makes transformers work. And you can't have transformer cores without them. And I handed my editor this piece that I wrote, and I said, well, it's like 3,000 words, but in my defense, I had to write about the entire global economy to make this make sense. It's complicated. And when it comes to things like manufacturing, the Biden administration, they talk about, we want to support American manufacturing. We want to address this aging infrastructure, and we want to do it through American made stuff. But in so many cases, that manufacturing, that ship has sailed, and it's literally has to be brought in on a ship now from somewhere else.
What's a typical lead time on in your analysis? What was your typical lead time on transformers distribution?
It's all over the place, but it's never good. It's gotten in some cases 10 times longer. I got one set of numbers when I was doing the story, and my VP, Mark Johnson, he had at the APPA conference, American Public Power Association, we had a roundtable of CEOs there, and I'm going to be writing a story about that soon in T&D World. I'm also planning on doing a podcast on it. But those CEOs said it was something like 20 months or longer, just brutal. And this is wiping out their reserves. There's so many pressures, so many drivers for this. There's residential construction, there's natural disasters, which are happening with a greater frequency and greater severity in many areas. If, say, for example, down in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, you guys have a storm surge that swamps a bunch of transformers or other grid gear with brine, that stuff's gone. That needs to be sent to a shop and refurbished, or it has to be replaced from an OEM. And now that just sucks up a big chunk of the supply for everybody else. Engineers also told me that the renewable energy build out too is a big pressure on transformers and other grid HVDC grid equipment, because they need all that stuff to connect with the grid, because you build a wind farm out in I don't know, the panhandle of Texas or somewhere. It's far away. It's where the renewable resource is good, which is usually in a remote area. And so it has a lot of T&D equipment needs that we don't necessarily think about. I've toured wind farms, and I think they're amazing. I actually am not one of those people who thinks wind farms are ugly, and I wouldn't mind one in my backyard. But you don't think about how they're connected to the grid, because a lot of it's underground and you don't see it. They're not connected by wires that you can see. But these are things that lay people don't think about. We are big fans of renewable energy, a lot of us, but there's a pressure on the manufacturing capability and the supply chain, which is not too reliable right now. There's also, that same kind of steel that I was talking about a minute ago is also integral for the manufacture of electric vehicles. So what you have is one material that is scarce in this hemisphere, and you can either build out the grid with it or build EVs. So what do? You need the grid for the EVs. People are becoming kind of terrified, utilities, are becoming kind of terrified about electric cars, and people might say, oh, they're just old, stodgy, conservative, monopoly man kind of people. They're all wearing monocles, and they don't think that of green energy or EVs as a good thing. And I'm forward thinking, and I do, but actually it's, again, more complicated than that, because some of these utilities are telling me if EV penetration goes above a certain level, and especially at a certain time of day, my grid is in a bad way. You know?
It is.
So then you are faced with a marketing problem, which is dang near intractable, which is, how do you change human behavior as an entity who needs it to change? One of the most difficult things to do in the discipline of marketing, right? So they're having to say, all right, maybe we will make your electricity free if you plug it in the middle of the night, and you don't plug in your EV like right when you get home from work, which is probably what you're gonna do if you have an EV. I don't have one, but if I did, I probably would just, I would get my errands done in the evening and I would plug my car in. But the problem is that's when everybody else is plugging everything else in. Everybody's pumping their AC. Electricity is scarce and expensive, and it could risk, brownouts. It can risk all kinds of grid instability, power quality problems. So there are people who see potential in things like vehicle to grid. Maybe we can use these cars as a way of storing energy. But that's kind of way on down the line. And what's more immediate is if too many people start adopting EVs, I might not be able to keep my grid up. And so that's where that note of terror in their voices comes from.
It's so true. What do we do? I mean, there are so many challenges that exist within the utility, grid, market, generation, you name it. A lot of buzz going on out there. A lot of, I know that utilities tend to be very pragmatic, and they're gonna still, hey, I got to still deliver power, because the regulatory agency is going to come and hit me upside the head if I don't do or fulfill my obligation.
Got to do your due diligence. Yeah.
Yes.
And
so I admit, I mean,
I admit sometimes I'm better at pointing out the problems than I am pointing out solutions, and that's unfortunate. But the industry, though, does have some very good things in its favor. We have a lot of things going for us, which is we actually, in many cases, don't compete with one another. And so that means we can do things like come together at conferences and share information.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The engineers who I rely on for my coverage are incredibly smart people. They are very interested in problem solving and collaborating. Like, so many of them are collaborative thinkers. I write stories by myself. I'm an old newspaper guy, and that's kind of how I do it. But then I'll get an article from somebody, and it'll have 7 authors, and I'm like, how did these people collaborate like this on a single thing? But then I realized that's just kind of how they work. Like, one guy knows one aspect of how this particular application works.
You're bringing up a good point. I think you've touched upon the necessity to educate. We've got to figure out how to communicate in a way that educates the communities, the people, the individuals, all of that stuff, and make it in such a way that they listen, right? So that's a challenge. But this whole concept behind collaboration, I think the challenges are so dynamic and so challenging. I believe that is only through collaboration. Somebody saying, hey, I solved the problem over here. Wow, I was having this problem over here. Let's share and be able to do that.
Yeah.
And I think you're right.
And there's less worry about, trade secrets and things like that. We have a culture of trade groups and sharing, comparing notes, which is great, and doesn't happen in a lot of other industries because you get into things like trade secrets. And another factor, and I'm not one of those people who will tell you that technology is going to save us from all of our problems, because I don't necessarily believe that. And I can get into more of that in a moment. But we do have some great advances in just things like computing power, and things like sensors becoming more cheap, cameras becoming more cheap. These things are big enablers when you combine them, especially. These are enablers of asset management, of power grid maintenance, of vegetation management, things like satellite technology, which is becoming, as I understand it, at least, more cost effective for utilities to deploy. I've even talked to some utilities who have their own in-house UAV drone pilots, which is kind of crazy to me. I know it's 2022 and we're supposed to have flying cars, but the idea that a utility would actually have, drone pilots, that's kind of something that only the Pentagon used to have. And now, like, a utility like Salt River Project has, and they have ones that can go underwater and check their hydro facilities. They have ones that can fly to the height of a transmission pylon and do checks that normally a person would have to do, or some kind of thermal camera, and you'd need someone on the ground to do. But regardless, you're saving, truck rolls, you're saving, sending people out. And also, it's a safety advantage too, because people working at height, training aside, and training is important. PPE is important. It's an inherently dangerous activity, even if you're, being completely, and this is an industry that has to take care of its people. I recently did a piece on employee retention and what we're calling the Great Resignation, or the big shakeup, or whatever you want to call it. But the plain fact of it is a lot of people are going to other industries, they're moving around. It's hard for a guy like me to get coverage of certain things, because everybody's switching jobs, and it becomes more important than ever to take good care of your people and make sure that you're training them well, equipping them well, letting them have the time off that they need to recuperate and do things like go down to Disney World with their kids, and decompress, so that they can, remain focused when they're doing this critical work. And, I think if we get to learn anything from COVID-19, I would hope that it would be that.
I think
take care of people.
That whole employee resource retention, things like that, training, bringing in new resources and new people, whatever it might be, new insights, technology. I think that's a heck of an interesting equation to try to solve, because if you can deploy technology like satellites, and then you can communicate, like, for example, hey, tree trimming crew, go out here. Don't worry about that. This is the reality, and make my moves, make the crew's move more efficient. That's a good thing. So you're getting more done in less time, and focusing these valuable people in the right direction. And I think you're bringing up a good point. But
it keeps each individual person working for a utility at basically maximum efficiency, because you're not doing a thing that you don't have to do. And it's, I would argue that it's good at both ends. It's good at the management end. It's good at the worker end. And we have to think about both, because, you can't manage anything without workers. And that's actually something that I always tried to bring our coverage back at Utility Products when I was editor over there. And that is a good spot to stay up to date on things like fleet management, power grid maintenance, asset management, the kind of sensor deployments that I've been talking about that make line inspections go easier, the vegetation management technology that I've been talking about that, keep these trimming crews organized. And, they can get so granular. I was talking to a guy from Portland General, right here in my backyard, and we've got some of the biggest trees in the world, unless you go down to Northern California to the redwoods. And they can actually, with a combination of, satellites and GIS and, handheld computers, they can get so granular that they can keep track of individual trees, which is just nuts to me. If you go out into one of these forests, in the Deschutes National Forest or other places like that, they can pull up the history of a tree, whether it's had disease, whether it's gone through drought, whether it's had an infection of some insect that's maybe bored holes in it and weakened it, and that makes it a danger. Might need to be removed, might need to be worked on, might need special attention of some other kind. And then how close it is to a grid asset, or things like that. And that's a level of granularity that has only recently become possible. And it at a time when everything seems to be taking longer, whether it's going to a drive-through or flying from Oregon to Florida on a plane. It seems like there's not enough employees to get anything done as quickly or as effectively as it used to be done. So I think labor saving stuff like that is only going to become more important.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's other drivers too, like, aging workforce in utilities, that's been talked about since I started writing.
Forever. I was doing a project many years ago, and they were talking about the silver tsunami of people leaving, and all that knowledge is like,
yeah, there's different names for it, and that's a pretty good one. But Yeah, and it's probably going to continue to be a problem because, someone was telling me as I was working on that retention story, uh, people don't think of going to work on the power grid and doing things like testing transmission pylons or designing transformers. They don't think of it as sexy as going to, say, I don't know, going to work for Meta, or going to work for Google. They don't think of it as attractive or as alluring as that. Nobody writes high concept prestige television about like a dude who sits in a lab all day and makes sure that vacuum switches work correctly. They do it about people who are writing code and things like that.
Right. Oh yeah.
So that's kind of what
we got to change that perception because it's important.
It's so important.
Yeah.
I mean, how are
Meta
you
wouldn't
running that
exist without
software?
power.
Yeah. How are you running that software
Yeah.
without power lines? You're
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
It's taken completely for granted, and
completely.
I mean,
so we're here to sort of change that perception. We're going to have to
hopefully.
wrap it up.
Okay, that's
we've been
great.
rifling for a long time.
Yeah.
How does somebody get a hold of you, Jeff? What's the best way to be able to say, I want to get a hold of Jeff?
Oh, sure. Well, I try to stay active on LinkedIn as much as I can, and check out our website at tdworld.com. And I believe that at either of those, you can find my contact information. And the people I want to talk to are people who are with utilities or who serve utilities and who can maybe have a good story about, a new application, a new labor-saving technology. We love case studies, things like that. It could also be something just as simple as I took a really cool photo or I have a really cool story, about. I'm actually working on something right now about how to stay safe in the backcountry. I met a lady at a recent conference who faced down a mountain lion, and that got me thinking. There's all kinds of workers who do all kinds of stuff in all kinds of places, and I'm sure there's more than one person who's got some interesting close call stories. So, keep an eye on our website for stuff like that, and I'd love to hear from you personally if you maybe have a story to tell.
I like that, man. Well, you were great, man. I really enjoyed the conversation. We could have gone on for hours and hours, and then I'd have to go get some coffee, and then continued on in the conversation. I can geek out on this stuff all day long. Thank you, Jeff, for being on Satellite Superheroes.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite, Scott.
Listeners, as well, we're going to be wrapping it up on the other side. Do not go away. We'll have all the contact information for Jeff, so stay tuned. Hey, thank you very much for joining Satellite Superheroes, and a hearty thank you to Jeff Postelwait. T&D World is the company. Senior editor is the title. It was an excellent conversation, and boy, you can tell there's a lot happening within the utility market, the utility space, and boy, technology has got to lead the way to make sure that when I come into my room, I flip that light switch, it happens. So go out, reach out to Jeff Postelwait. You will not be disappointed. Once again, thank you very much, and we're going to have another great conversation shortly, so do not go away. Stay tuned.